Hi, my friend, and welcome to another episode of the Midlife Reinvention Podcast. I hope you're doing really well today. Today's episode is a real treat, and as I speak with Linda Rossetti, and we really discuss how disruptions in our life are normal and how we can learn from them and grow in transformational ways. We want to also discuss how our emotions, if we really pay attention to them and about how we feel, can serve us and guide us in transformative ways. We celebrated Thanksgiving here in Canada this past weekend, and it was really an opportunity for reflection on all that we are thankful for. And really, there is so much. Despite all the turmoil that is happening in the world, we must remain centered and consider, what am I really thankful for at this moment? I was able to practice the method called HAIL, or reframing my emotions, today, and it was really powerful. I recognized and honored that one emotion I was feeling, and that was very prevalent, was frustration. I honored its presence and asked myself, why is it here? I realized it was here because I'm constantly doing, and doing. And I'm sure you can relate to that. And just wanting more and more and expecting things to manifest right away. And then when they don't, I become frustrated, always wanting more without stopping to think about what is already manifested. If I ask myself, if I ask myself, how has this emotion really influenced me? It has influenced me with stress and worry, and which is really manifesting physically in that I've got a headaches and backaches, and that is the result of my frustration. And that's not serving me well. If I was to ask myself, what can I learn from this emotion of frustration? It is this: I can't control the outcomes of my actions. I can only control my thoughts and my reactions. Rather than worrying about the outcome or manifestations, I need to be appreciative of all that is manifested already. Don't always be worried about the next thing, because the next thing won't come if you worry about it. Really, again, it's the law of attraction, and what you think about manifests. And if I think of the lack of something which causes frustration, more of that will come to me. It was a really powerful exercise to break down my feeling of frustration. And it just made me lighter and thankful for all that I have and all that has been manifested, and excited for all that I know is coming my way. I am so thankful for you, my wonderful listeners, who take your time for your own personal growth. I truly am, and I don't take it lightly at all. Think about how your emotions can be your guidance system. I'm here to help you unpack that if you'd like, as I've been trained in this exact process. Let me know what you think of my thoughts this morning, and also how you enjoy this podcast with Linda Rossetti. Feedback is very important to me, so it really also does help me to improve my offerings to you. So shoot me a message at kavita@itsmytimenowcoaching.com, and let's chat about what disruptions or emotions that you're feeling at this moment. I'm here for you. Enjoy this next episode, and I'll see you at the end with the key takeaways. Welcome, everyone, to the Midlife Reinvention Podcast, a podcast for women in transition in their careers and life. I'm your host, Kavita Ahuja, and my goal with this podcast is to inspire you to rediscover all that resides within you and help you unleash it to the world with confidence. If you may be going through transitions in your career or life and wondering, what's next? I'm here to tell you that you can do this, and I want you to believe and say with confidence, it's my time now. To this end, I interview incredible women for this podcast who share their stories of reinvention and who will give you their advice on how to overcome the obstacles in your way to reach your vision for yourself in this next stage of life. This week, I am thrilled and honored to have on the show for the second time Linda Rossetti. I recently had the privilege of participating in a certification course for the groundbreaking emotional reframing tool called HAIL, researched and created by Linda. And as a result, I just had to have her back on the show to discuss her important research and her new book, Dancing with Disruption. Linda is a business leader, a Harvard MBA, and a social entrepreneur who is dedicated to advancing our understanding of and response to personal and organizational transformation. She is the author of two books, as I said, one, Dancing with Disruption, and the next, Women and Transition. Her work has been featured on NPR, Money Magazine, Next Avenue, Thrive Global, and other outlets. Previously, Linda served as Executive Vice President of HR and Administration at Iron Mountain and as CEO of eMaven, a venture capital-based technology company. She hosts the podcast Destination Unknown. She also leads the Transition Institute, a consultancy that collaborates on research and certifies others on transformational methods. Linda, I am so happy
Kavita,
and honored to have you on the show again.
Kavita, it's so nice to be here. Thank you. And thank you for that kind introduction. And I want to recognize right up front the wonderful work that you do with women who are in transition. It's essential, and I'm cheering for you every moment. It's really wonderful work, and how lucky for those who kind of come into your orbit.
Well, thank you so much. I really appreciate that. It really means a lot to me because I wanted to have you on not only because of your important work, but also you're a mentor for me. So learning from you has been a privilege. And so I really wanted our listeners to understand the importance of your teachings and especially the teachings and the recent teachings that you've imparted in the book Dancing with Disruption. So I would love to get into that and give you some examples from your own life and from people that you were included in your research. So I'm excited to dive right in.
Me as well. Me as well.
Yes, yes. So Linda, this book, Dancing with Disruption, I have it here. Just a little plug.
Thank you.
It comes at the heels of your previous book, Women in Transition. And as I was reading the introduction, it really indicates that the book is an invitation to change how we respond to shifts in our thinking about who we are. And I wanted to stress that you stress that these shifts are normal. They're a normal part of adult life, and they do signal really an invitation for us to grow in a transformational way. And so, if I could just ask you, what triggered you to write this book, and why is it so important, especially perhaps now?
Yeah, so thank you for that question. It's a lovely question to start with because we can go in a lot of different directions, right? The
Yes.
quick answer is I wrote the book for two reasons, right? One is because after a decade of research, I noticed patterns in people's stories that really change the way I think, and I hope others think, about these experiences in life when we have a break in how we've come to know ourselves, right? We've been a career sales rep, and all of a
Mm,
sudden it's like, well, wait a minute, is this who I want to be, or I don't want to be this anymore, or we've lost a connection and we instantly say, oh my goodness, something must be wrong with me, right? We're
right.
conditioned with these responses, and from the data and research, I found that in fact, that's really a misunderstanding of what's happening because those kind of moments are enormous invitations to help us expand. And it's really that kind of pattern that prompted me to write the book. But I would be remiss if I didn't say it's partly also my experience, right? Because more than a decade ago, I found this topic of transitions in adult life. And I hesitate to use the word transition because lots of communities claim that word. And I've kind of deferred to kind of saying, look, there are these moments of shifts in how we think about ourselves. But I had that almost a decade ago, and I struggled mightily, right? As
Hmm.
you referenced my background, at the time I was serving as the head of HR and administration for a large global company, right? I was doing
Hmm.
laps around the planet on an airplane, and we had business in 37 countries. So it was a busy day.
Wow. Yeah.
And and I went through this period of saying, my goodness, something must be wrong with me because I had I was not functioning at the way that in a characteristic way. And I struggled to find resources that spoke to the enormity of what was happening for me.
Hmm.
And and that prompted me to go ask some questions. And that's really not the end of the story, because as I look at the last decade, as I've been doing research, I'm kind of a couple of miles down the path ahead of everyone else who I'm researching, because I've gone through cycles of growth in this decade that are so radically different from where I thought I was starting when I served as head of HR and administration. I mean, where this transition has brought me is an enormous change from where I was, and yet I'm not radically doing things differently. I'm approaching things in totally new ways. And so long-winded answer to say I wrote this book because one, this incredible research that I've done where hundreds of people have shared with me their experience about major life shifts, and also my own experience.
Hmm.
And I think it's timely now because everywhere we look right now, there are disruptions, right? All over the workplace, in society, our economy. We could go on and on. Great news, longevity is extending lives. Well,
Hmm.
okay, that means careers and earnings profiles might need to change for decades. We have technology that's eliminating some careers that we thought might have been there for our lifetimes, right? So there's
Yeah.
so much disruption. Part of the reason why I write this book is that every one of us needs to upskill in terms of our ability to navigate disruption. And so the book is motivated by so many things, Kavita, but it is a labor of love, right? My work, Matt, you mentioned, I think of myself as a social entrepreneur. My work is really about helping people think differently about
Mm.
what I thought when it happened to me was this unusual, it was only happening to be odd behavior, and what now I understand to be a completely normal, common experience. And that is disruption repeatedly over adult lives. And we have this
Mm.
great opportunity now, particularly, to learn how to respond differently.
Mm. Everything you said just resonates with me so much because I went through that as well, as you know, and that was about 5 or 6 years ago. And at the time, I thought as well, like, what is wrong with me? Like, there's got to be something wrong with me because
Right.
everything from the outside is perfect, and I don't know what's wrong with me. And like you, I started looking around and saying, I'm not the only one. So that's when I dug deeper into it, and it's really wonderful to now have these tools that you provided to be able to understand what are these disruptions all about, and how can we manage them. So yeah, thanks for sharing that. Those are some great reasons for for writing this book. So
It is the approach of the book, which is to give people a platform for conversation with themselves and others, right? So there is
mhm,
a fair amount of the book is just education, right? Which is giving people a new way to think about these moments of shifts in our lives. And we should be clear, they can be prompted by occupational shifts, they can be prompted by relationships, by health or physical capabilities, by spirituality, like energy,
mhm,
spirituality. It can be on any plane, right? But these
mhm,
shifts
mhm.
occur. And so the work that I do is really about educating people on what's really happening when those things are occurring, and then
Mhm.
also providing these interactive exercises, right? These tools that I refer to that allow people to, work with yourself and others to reflect on things that might help them ask new questions of themselves, because I think that's
Yes.
really the answer is if we can kind of break out of our normal pattern of, oh my goodness, what's happening, we ask the question like, oh my goodness, something must be wrong, to
Mm.
actually bringing a fresh new question.
Yes.
That's when real acceleration can happen.
Yes, yes, absolutely. Yes. And I'm glad you mentioned those different examples because when you speak about disruptions, there can be different kinds, right? They can be unplanned, like you mentioned, it could be like a divorce or a job loss, or it could be things that are unanticipated, or that feeling that something's not quite right, which is what I had, right, at the time. So in the book, you talk about kind of two dimensions of a disruption, right? And so the one is the impact on how we function, and the second is the influence on our thinking. And then you also talk about a concept called a gateway disruption, which I think is a really important thing. If you could maybe explain that a little bit. What is a gateway disruption, and how can these disruptions impact or influence us, or both?
Sure. And thank you for recognizing that in the book. We start off the conversation in the book by saying, well, look, disruption is all around us, right? It can happen
Yes.
on our way to a doctor's appointment. We can run into a traffic jam and when a kerfuffle happens and we're
Hmm.
completely knocked off kilter, but we quickly reset and resume our day, right? So
Yeah.
the disruptions that are handled in the book, these gateway disruptions, are kind of the opposite of those, that the kind of minor, unexpected things that kind of color our existence.
Right.
The
Right.
ones that we talk about really are those, as you mentioned, that have one of two patterns that I observed repeatedly in the research, right? One is that they impact our functioning, right? Like all of a sudden, we're maybe characteristically very high achieving women, and yet for some reason we're not able to function at our normal level, right? What was
Hmm.
normal for us, recognizing of course that we're all different. What normal is for each of us differs. And the other is if we recognize that there's some kind of break in our thinking about who we are, and when either of those two patterns are happening, it typically is this gateway opportunity, which is a time that we can choose to respond differently. And that's what's so important in the book. And I tell a very funny story in the book, and your listeners might enjoy this, that for me, it was hard for me not to have these disruptions and just say, oh, bad day, bad day.
Yeah. Yeah.
And one time, and this is so silly, right? One time I was leaving the office and I worked in the city. So we had like these parking garages that were under the buildings. And we
Yeah.
had to leave our keys in the car because the
Right.
attendants in the garage would move the cars around all day long because we would park like 3 and 4 deep because there was no room in this garage.
Right.
And so
Right.
one day, the babysitter had to like leave on the dot 5:30. Linda, you have to be home because it was
Hmm.
critical. And so I
Hmm.
was running. I had a phone in the ear, running from a conference call, like take the elevator down. And when the elevator doors opened, the two cars that just happened to be right in front of me were the two cars owned by my house, right? And so without thinking, I hopped in a Honda Pilot, which is what I typically drove every day to the office. And
Yes.
I was on my way, like I have to get out of this garage and get home. And so I go up all the levels and it's round and round and round, swipe my badge at the reader to exit. And once I get out into this like heavy rush hour, one-way traffic, I clear the building and all of a sudden the radio kicks on in the car. And I am sitting in a beige interior Honda Pilot where
Oh no.
mine is smoky gray.
Oh
Now I have been
shoot.
in the car. I've been in the car for minutes, Kavita, right?
Oh
This isn't
my
just like five
God.
seconds. This is minutes, right? And so I say that to for your listeners to say when I say non-functioning, right, that there's a break in our functioning, right? Some of these disruptions work kind of silently, but they decompose our normal functioning level. And I think
Hmm.
that day was an excellent example for me, right? My normal patterns of functioning were being thrown off kilter. It was like the
Yes.
universe was trying to get my attention. Like, Linda,
Yes.
you need to pay attention to this. And I think ultimately, this is what I'm suggesting, that there are times in our lives where a variety of things can happen. It's not often single threaded, right? There can be
Hmm.
lots of things happening, but they cause us to recognize that there's an opportunity to pause and really
Hmm.
think that perhaps there's a different response required. And I use that in loads of other stories in the book that say, look, if we respond differently at those moments, there can be great goodness ahead. And so
Hmm.
that's the disruption right at the beginning. I think it's always valid to take a minute and do some definitions.
Yes.
And the disruptions that I'm interested in, and I know you're interested in as well, Kavita, are those that are really meaningful,
Yeah.
that are asking people to rethink a little bit about who they are and how
Who they
they
are.
hold meaning in this world.
Yes.
And that's really what a gateway disruption is.
So did you get your car?
Yes, but after more drama.
Okay.
It wasn't just a straight
Okay.
shot. But
All right.
I'll let your listeners go find that
Yeah,
out
we'll
on their
have to
own.
read the book in order to.
It is a very
That's
funny story. I'm
interesting.
embarrassed to
Yes.
tell you, but it is
Well,
very
no, I mean,
funny.
it's interesting, right? Because it completely, these things put you off kilter, like you said, and then things happen and it's like a knock in the head. It's like, wow, now I know, you look back at it, I know that now it's like, it was kind of a signal
Right.
to say, oh, hold on a second, what's going on, right? So,
Well, and I think that that's the thing.
yeah.
If I had the education at that time, I could have interpreted that moment very differently.
Yes.
Instead, it took me almost another year of
Mm.
torment from that moment, of
Mm-hmm.
continual like decomposing on
Mm-hmm.
various planes,
Mm-hmm.
and getting to a point where it said, wait a minute, stop the presses here. We have to do something different here.
Yes, yes, yes. And I mean, something that happened, the kind of disruption happened to me as well. And I had this inner voice that was telling me that things needed to change, right? Or that there's something that was more inside of me. And I thought that by maybe changing the circumstances, like maybe changing my job or getting a different role, or by, I don't know, doing things differently, that internal voice would go away or it would just dissipate. So that leads me to my next question about the difference between change and transition. And that's really fascinating. And that you mentioned, and we had talked about this before as well, is that change involves kind of a known outcome, right? But as you talked about, transitions actually require us to re-examine our assumptions, right? And it's always a choice. So can you kind of explain this a little bit further, and that how I think there was a really great example in your book about a mountain trail. And maybe that will be an example of what the difference is between change and transition.
Sure. And I found through this research that there are really, at times of disruption, right, when we're at these gateway moments, there are actually meaningful differences between these two words, change and transition, even though we're really socialized to use them interchangeably. Right. So
Hmm.
at moments when we are in this kind of state of disruption, changes are very goal oriented, right? They're actually used to make alterations or variations on an intact, right, or static self-concept, right? And that is very important, right? We say, okay, I am a butcher, a baker, a candlestick maker. I'm going to make some changes, a new job, a new apartment, a new whatever. We're maintaining the stability of our known self-concept under change.
Mm.
What happens in transitions is we're saying, okay, we're not entirely sure what the outcome will be. We're not making an alteration, so therefore we cannot define the outcome. We're going to
Mm.
welcome instability for a time. But through that, what we're doing is we're re-examining the assumptions upon which we anchor our self-concept, right? So maybe we're the butcher, the baker, the candlestick maker, but maybe some of the assumptions that we use to define those things need to be updated or need to be
Hmm.
thrown out and new ones welcomed, right? So
Hmm.
transitions really are welcoming this instability in self-concept for a time. And I do use this story in the book that, and I'm happy that it meant something to you, because I thought that it was really interesting as I started to do the research and I needed
Hmm.
people in the research to kind of understand what I was talking about. I always talked about this mountain, and
Hmm.
it's as if we're hiking on a mountain, right? That has all
Yeah.
these horizontal loops that kind of go around and around. But what's different about this mountain is that the horizontal loops never gain altitude, right? They
Altitude.
only go
Yeah.
around, right? And the only way to gain altitude is to choose a transition, right? Is to go up, right? To evaluate our self-concept so that we can get to a higher elevation. And what's fascinating is that we can make all sorts of alterations, believing, of course, that another loop around the same horizontal is actually something new. But in
Mm.
fact,
Hmm.
we've gained absolutely no elevation. We're doing the exact same thing, just
In a
some
different way.
different way, right? It
Yeah.
might be stormy on the mountain this time around, and last time maybe it was sunny, but we've not gained any elevation. And what's happening at a disruption is that we're being placed at the trailhead, right? The trailhead of
Mm-hmm.
of an ascent, and we're being asked to say, will we ascend? And I think that that's the invitation that disruption is really offering us. And
Mm.
from my research, what I've learned is that while when we think mountain, we think of this kind of sloping to a peak. And what I've learned is that if we choose transition and choose to ascend, we invert the mountain, right? We expand as we go up. And it's quite
Oh, beautiful.
fascinating.
Mm.
And it is repeated regardless of the circumstances, again and
Oh,
again. And it is
yeah.
quite lovely.
Yeah, that example really put it into focus for me, I have to say. And I think when you talked about the ascent going from one level to the next, would that ascent kind of be, would you kind of label that as that transformational growth that occurs? Yeah,
Absolutely. That
right.
when we're choosing transition, what we're doing is we're embarking on a path of transformational growth, right? That is
Mm-hmm.
that is actually the choice that we're making. And
Mm-hmm.
transformational growth is all about this process of saying, okay, what are the assumptions and expectations we use to define who we are,
Mm-hmm.
and evaluating them. And that isn't like a binary, like I'm flicking the switch, woohoo, I did it, I'm
Mm-hmm.
done.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
this iterative process of first becoming aware of the expectations that we carry for ourselves,
Mm-hmm.
and then evaluating which ones are still valid and which ones might have outlived their useful life,
Mm-hmm.
and then which ones we might perhaps welcome anew. They may build on our experience, they may be totally new. So this notion of transformational growth is really this process through which we re-examine our expectations and definition of who we are, and it
Mm-hmm.
really moves away from what typically happens in early adulthood, is where we're setting our expectation and definition for who we are based on our external environment, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's the communities we live in, it's our families, our religious affiliation, our education, the occupation we choose. And we take bits and pieces of all of those things and we create this composite of self. And that
Yes.
is what we use to evaluate how we're doing, if we're loved, we're making progress, all these things. But
Mm-hmm.
as we embark on a period of transformational growth, what we're doing is we're welcoming an opportunity to re-examine all of those assumptions. And it
Mm-hmm.
isn't as if we throw the baby out with the bathwater. Like a lot of times
Mm-hmm.
that's what people think, like, oh, transition, I have to leave everything and start
Mm-hmm.
anew. Really what's happening is we're bringing into awareness those assumptions we carry, and we're
Mm-hmm.
thinking about which ones are
Yes.
still valid, and
Yes.
which ones may be ready to say, you know what, I'm ready to let that go. There's a woman who participated in my research, and she came in and she said, for nearly 20 years, she said, I held this singular goal, which was I wanted to be a GM by the time I was 40. And every juncture, every
Mm-hmm.
disruption was met with that same clear, very targeted outcome she was pursuing. And she got to about 37 or 38, and she said, you know what? I started to see cracks that, like, that wasn't really something that appealed to me. I held it, but there was this gap I began to be aware of between the things that made me happy, that energized me, that kind of engaged my heart, and what that meant.
What that meant. Yeah.
And that for her was this beginning of a process to really dig into what did it mean to be a GM at by 40, and why did that make sense?
Yes.
And
Yes.
her process was this iterative set of steps that helped her look at what in fact did
Mm-hmm.
matter and
Mm-hmm.
helped her repot her career
Yeah.
in a different way.
A great example. Really great example. I love that when you talk about the iterative steps because I often, when I'm coaching my clients, they faced with a transition or something that's disruptive in their life, and they think they have to know it all right away, and that they have to everything has to be planned. But I often suggest that it's one step at a time. You do one thing and it opens up something else. You just have to be open to it. Right.
Right,
And so I think that's similar to what you're talking about in that we don't have to know, we don't have to see the top of the mountain, right? We can just go
right, right.
using your analogy, right? So
We only have
yes,
to make the choice of taking the next trailhead. That's all we have to
yes,
do, right?
exactly.
Because ultimately we have these lovely, many times untapped set of skills that come to bear to help us make that traverse.
Hmm.
So
Hmm. Hmm.
it's quite lovely if we trust ourselves to make those steps.
Yes, absolutely. Wonderful. So, Linda, I wanted to get into a little bit about these tools that you've discussed. I know we can't go through all of them because there's a ton, but you have a toolkit called the Incubator, which is in the book, and I encourage our listeners to read the book because it's got a ton of wonderful examples and tools that we can actually use on ourselves. But so there's four separate tools which you have in the incubator, and the first one is reframing our emotions. The second one is resetting our expectations. The third is reimagining our identity. And the fourth is reconstituting connections. So again, there's so much in there, but I just if we really focus on the first one, which is reframing our emotions, and that is what I've been certified in as well, which I love. And but you say that our emotions can serve as an oracle, not an obstacle. to our success, which is amazing. So maybe you can explain that. And if you could briefly talk about what is HAIL, which is the acronym for this tool, and maybe kind of go through that and with an example, perhaps, if you might.
Of course, of course. And
Yes.
I thank you for giving us this time to talk about emotions, right? Because the thing that I found most striking, right? I sat down with nearly 300 people, right, through my research, and these people brought
Mm-hmm.
me to their most important moments, right? They
Mm-hmm.
shared with great loss and great excitement, right? Something, a long-awaited promotion happened, and that could be the reason for the transformation. But
Yes.
the thing that was most striking was the role our emotions play in all of these shifts throughout our lives. And what's interesting, I had to go and look at some academic research to make sure that I was interpreting what I heard correctly. And I found this fascinating work by this gentleman whose name is Jack Mesereau. He's now deceased, but he was a professor at Columbia University for many, many years. And he observed through his research that people who are going through periods of rapid transformation actually have two levels of activities that need to happen. One level is very practical, right? We have the woman who wanted to be a GM, no longer wants to be a GM. She says, okay, I need to earn an income. What am I going to do, right? Very practical. But
Mm-hmm.
there's another level that requires an equal amount of dedication. And that is our emotional reaction to the change. Because what Mesereau observed was that when we disengage from a stable self concept, our emotions fire to keep us safe, right? Our
Mm-hmm.
emotional system is just as exquisite as our respiratory system or our endocrine system, right? It is a bodily system that knows how to work to keep us safe. And so
Mm-hmm.
when we say, okay, I'm no longer going to be a GM, and we disengage knowingly saying, okay, I'm okay, it's going to be unstable for a time, the emotions are firing. And so this reframing emotion tries to give us a technique that allows us to honor the presence of these emotions, but also allow us to keep moving on this transformational path that we really want to pursue. And
Mm-hmm.
so HAIL, which is a four-letter mnemonic, which means each of the four letters of the word HAIL, HAIL, each of them stands for an activity. And what the activity does is it helps us reframe our relationship with an emotion, right? So and reframe gets a lot of press right now. It's like one of those fancy words like vulnerability or authenticity. Like it's
Yes.
almost like it loses meaning. So let me take a minute and just say what I think reframing means, right? It's as
Please do.
if Kavita and I stepped outside right now and I said, okay, Kavita, let's draw that building that's right in front of us. And Kavita goes to work and she does it. And when she finishes, I say, okay, come. And we go across the street and we ride up me in the elevator of an adjacent building and we go to the rooftop. And I say, okay, Kavita, let's draw that same building, but now you have to do it from a different vantage point, right? So your
Mm-hmm.
ability to see something familiar, right? That building that we just saw in front of us changes radically. And
Mm-hmm.
that's exactly what hail does with our emotions, right? So
Mm-hmm.
it takes what can be an oppositional emotion, rage, sadness, self-doubt, perfectionism, and allows us to be different with that emotion. And I describe it often, and I'll use an emotion for me, right? Sadness is just something that's often I carry that. It's been a part of my existence for my life. And with hail, right, or on a day that I don't practice hail, it's as if I'm hanging on the end of a rope and sadness can like whip me around willy-nilly. It wants to change my direction. Whoop, it does it in an instant. And I
Yes.
really have no control other than just hanging on because it has total power over me when it's active. But what hail allows me to do was to say, okay, I see you, sadness, and I can drop the rope on the ground next to me, right? So it can't whip me around and change my
Mm-hmm.
direction at will. It's still there, right? I see it, it's right next to me, but it
Mm-hmm.
doesn't have power over. And that's what hail helps us do. It diffuses an emotion's power over us. And that is essential, right back to Jack Mesereau's research, that's essential to being able to move on the practical side is really to diffuse the power over us that emotions can have.
Mm.
And I use the tool all the time. I'm trying to think if I have a good example. I can tell a story from my own experience if that makes sense. Do you want me to give a
Sure.
story about it?
Sure. Sure.
So
Of course.
there's
That
this
would be
really,
great.
the great news about hail is we can use it in the moment, right? We can use it in the moment when we have an emotion that's kind of firing at us, or we
Yes.
can use it in retrospect. We can say, you know what, that was a terrible period of my life. Let's let's reflect on that emotion and its role. So it can be used both ways. But I'll give you an example of mine because it'll push us to understand how these emotions can become oracles, right? So
Okay.
there was this one time where I was asked to do a meaningful consulting project, right? A lot of what I do, in addition to educating and being a social entrepreneur, is working as companies go through major organizational changes. So I was asked to take the talent component of a big post-merger integration project. And it was myself and a number of executives, all of whom I knew. We had all worked together before in the past, and we were helping this big company kind of merge two companies together. And so
Yes.
this one day we had a meeting with the CEO and CFO, whole day long meeting going over critical path issues. And this one gentleman who I knew well ran the IT. And
Yes.
so every time he talked about somebody else in the room, he said, "Oh, Jane needs to do this, or John needs to do this." But every time he referenced my area, he refused to say my name. He said, "Talent needs to do this," or "Talent is behind on this." He never acknowledged me. Now, as the
Hmm.
morning goes on, it's as if my blood is boiling. I'm just getting
Yeah.
more
No doubt.
furious,
No doubt.
furious by the minute. Like my top was going to blow off because
Yeah.
I was just so angry. And so this is stewing as these conversations. And at one point, just before lunch, he said something, and I was snappy. And like everyone in the room looked at me like, Linda, why are you acting that way? And nobody else observed what he was doing, right? And I was just fit to be tied. So at the lunch break, I say, okay, we were kind of breaking to another conference room, and there were high tables. So I grabbed my laptop and went over to a table and basically used a decoy to say, I need a break from all of you. I'm just going to sit here and have my sandwich. But I went through hail. And I said, okay, what's happening here? I'm angry. Right. That
Yes.
first step is honor. Anger was there for me. And it's unusual because I'm not really somebody that carries anger.
Hmm.
So that one was interesting, but hail helped me name all the emotions, and anger was the one that was so raw and that I wanted to work with.
Yes.
And the next step of hail asks us to think about, okay, why does anger have meaning in our experience? And I really struggled with that one because anger didn't have a lot of runtime in my experience. It's just not something I don't get angry a lot at
Yeah.
people. But ultimately, I pushed and I was like, well, maybe it has to do with not being respected by
Mhm.
this gentleman. And I kept asking, right? And Hale gives us prompts to help us keep asking to dig at this. And what I ultimately found, and I'm aware that we need to keep moving because I'm talking way too long, but
No, no, no. Please. This is a
um,
great example. I love it.
ultimately what I came to is that something that's very meaningful to me is being seen. And I don't mean like
Hmm.
standing in front of you, you can see me, but being acknowledged, making sure my voice and my contributions are heard. And
Hmm.
what was happening in that room is that I was being unseen by this gentleman.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so the ask was helping me really get at what meaning anger was holding for me.
Hmm.
And the next step I influence is to bring out how that meaning is influencing us. And that was easy
Hmm.
to answer that one. And that one was clear, right? I was acting in
Angry.
response to anger in
Yeah.
ways that again were uncharacteristic. I'm not somebody that like snaps at somebody in a meeting, right?
Yeah.
So it was
Yeah.
influencing me in a way that that rope like flicking me around, it was really
Yeah.
doing a number on me. But ultimately, Hale asks us to say, what if that emotion is there to teach us something, right? What might we learn, right? The L is learn.
Mm.
And that prompt really helped me get to a beautiful place, which is it really wasn't about him. It was
Mm.
about me voicing, right? Bringing my voice to the conversation and my willingness to do it.
Mm.
And it was a lovely reminder of what I needed to do. And so in the afternoon, he was diffused, right? He could stand on his head and do something, and I wouldn't have even really seen it, let alone reacted to it. But
Mm.
I was inspired by this notion of what it meant for me to be seen and the actions and the agency I had for that. And I,
Hmm.
at one point, offered something that was, I didn't think it was all that meaningful, but I put it into the conversation thinking that it was really important. And it actually turned the conversation for the next hour or so in terms of what we needed to work on. And as I was walking out that day, the CEO pulled me aside and he's like, Linda, I'm so happy you were here. Thank you for your contributions. And so I just
Wow.
have to say that it's a simple illustration of hail in the moment, right?
Yes.
That so often we are buffeted by our emotional response to a circumstance, particularly circumstances that involve us
Mm,
stepping away from a familiar, a stable sense of
mm,
self. And we
mm-hmm,
very often read meaning into that. We often, to emotion, say, oh, there must be something wrong with me.
mm,
What I submit to you is Hale is fantastic at helping us reframe those emotions. It's fantastic at helping us ask ourselves new questions and recognizing that what this whole process is really about is our voice and our
yes.
willingness to use our voice in all the circumstances of our lives. And
Mm.
so I thank you for giving us some airtime on this. I'm
No,
thrilled.
that's
Kavita is one of many who are trained, certified on Hale, and it is a groundbreaking technique that I am certain is going to contribute to the success of legions of leaders as we go forward, particularly because we have such disruption in our environment. So, Kavita, I'm thrilled for you that you use it in your practice and I'm excited about its power because it is quite
yes.
meaningful.
It is so powerful. And thank you for sharing that really great example because it really brings into perspective, like even on an everyday basis, when we have these emotions that seem to take control over us, and then we kind of blame the circumstances or other people or the situation. And then if we stop and ask these really important questions, we internalize them and say, hey, what's really going on? And it usually ends up being it's our own internal compass. And we realize that that emotion has taken over
Right.
and if we take that power back, like you said, and reframe it into what can we actually learn from this? And so powerful. It's really, and I'm really excited to use it more and more in my practice because it is really important because we're emotional beings, right?
Right. And the thing
So,
that is fascinating is how much we miss getting the intelligence out of our experience of the emotions. We
yes.
kind of stop with the feeling. Oh, I'm feeling sad, angry, happy, self-doubt, vulnerable. All those things are good, right? I'm not judging any emotion. There's no right or
Hmm.
wrong emotion in this. But what we too often are subject to is this notion that we're not getting the intelligence out of these emotions, and they can really inspire
Hmm.
us and direct us in ways that are profound.
And it's about the perspective on why is that showing up, like you mentioned about the building and how do you see the building? And it's about changing our perspective as well and responding to that perspective in a meaningful way. So so important. And I mean that's just one of the wonderful tools that you have from your research you have given us. So there was other ones, and I thank you for sharing the hail, but that's definitely I'm excited, as I said, to dive into even deeper as I move along in my practice. But
Sure. And I do think,
uh,
like, part of my work is that I want to make sure that there's a way that people can begin the conversation just by doing these exercises. So, as you said,
mhm,
there's exercises in each of the 10 chapters in the book, and they're all intended, like the exercise, which is Hail, to help us begin to ask new questions. And that
yeah,
unlocks incredible power.
yes, yes. There was a few that I really and another couple of exercises that really I thought were great, especially for perhaps women, for example, who are maybe going through a change in their life that they're wondering, how do I actually tell people about it? And one of the exercises was how we tell our personal stories. And usually what we resort to is kind of like a chronology of our life, like this happened and then this happened, and then that's how we explain where we are at. Versus you suggest that rather than doing it in a chronological way,
Right? It's a big word.
we use a value-based kind of explanation, or one that what do we value, and therefore that's how we should tell our stories, or that would be an example of a more powerful example, I think, of telling our stories. So any thoughts on that? Or
Yeah, it's so interesting that you pick up on that because I think that any of us who have been through a period of great shifts in our lives, realize that one of the most hated questions we get is, "What's up?" or "How are you?"
Mm.
And I remember one woman in my research who said, if they don't have a half an hour, I don't know how to respond to them because
Right.
I'm in this kind of big place that I'm trying to make sense. I don't have the words. And so part of the research that I did was taking 80 people and working with them over a long period of time and giving them tools to see what actually worked. And one of the most meaningful tools was this shift in the architecture of our storytelling. And
Mm-hmm.
as you very appropriately point out, that we're conditioned to use chronology as the architecture of our story. You know, I did this and
Mm-hmm.
this and this, and then voila, here I am. And the most meaningful way to get out of the anxiety of being in between and not being able to kind of articulate for others where we're at is reverting to an architecture that is values based, right? To say what's a value to me, as I mentioned in the last example, is being seen.
Mm-hmm.
And the book outlines some techniques on how to integrate that value statement into a story that draws a listener in and creates an opportunity for them to be a resource to you, which is the ideal, by the way, as you're going through a shift. So this notion of decoupling from chronology is really, it's incredibly powerful, not just at times of transition, but any time in our lives, right? Because I oftentimes have people, without telling them much, I say, okay, introduce yourself. And they go and they 99% of them do a chronology. And then I give them a little prompt and I say, okay, now I want you to reintroduce yourself. Only this time I want you to use, pick any value, one value that you hold true, and use that to anchor your story. And
Mm-hmm.
people come back and say, my gosh, it was like meeting somebody new. Like they're two different
Mm-hmm.
people. And
Mm-hmm.
so I just submit that to you that we, underneath all of this work on disruption and transformational growth, is this notion of voice. And when I say voice, I don't really mean what you hear audibly when I speak,
Yeah.
right? I've been talking now for nearly an hour. You know that I'm a Bostonian, right? I have an accent that's a Bostonian, but it's not really about what I'm audibly saying. When I say voice, I'm really talking about our truth, right? Our essence, who we are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And storytelling is a way to begin to really think about what that truth is. And I don't mean to sound silly by saying that, because as we come into adulthood, we're so used to adopting expectations and assumptions from around us. What that can do is that can really shape our voice, sometimes mute our voice. And
Mm-hmm.
so the
Mm-hmm.
first step in a transformational process is oftentimes really kind of trying to connect in a current way with voice, with our truth. And
Mm-hmm.
then there's a separate step from that, which says, okay, if I now understand that, how will I act in alignment with it? How?
Mm-hmm.
And that
Mm-hmm.
isn't
Mm-hmm.
clear often, right? So I
Yes.
remember there was this one event I did in Chicago for a number of nonprofit leaders, and it was a half day event. And we talked a lot about voice. And at the end, people were just chatting with one another. And these two women came up with me. And one woman arrived first, and she was in tears. And she said, Linda, I can hear my voice. It's screaming at me. But
Oh.
she was terrified, right? Terrified by the consequences of acting in alignment with her voice,
Mm-hmm.
right? Many of us come to these moments mid to later in life. We have so many responsibilities. It's real. She's like, I can see the consequences and I don't know how to process how to act in alignment with that voice. That is one very realistic scenario of what's happening as we're navigating a transformative growth process. The
Mm-hmm.
lady standing right next to her immediately put her hand above her eyebrows and started searching like she was a seafarer in olden days. And she said, I'm searching. I haven't seen my voice in 30 years.
Wow.
Right. And so I say that not to say one or the other is right. I just want to
Yes.
honor the fact that part of this process of responding to disruption is recognizing that our own voice and our awareness of it is a step we need to take. And it's part of the process. And
Yes.
it's okay to be at a place of recognizing our voice and being terrified to act in alignment of it. And it's okay to
Mm-hmm.
be at a place where we don't really know our voice. And it's okay to be anywhere in between, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
the work is really about raising our awareness to voice and then
Mm-hmm.
considering how we're going to act in alignment with it. And there's no right answer. It is how
Mm-hmm.
we will do it. And that differs for everyone.
Mm-hmm. I love that example. That's I haven't heard my voice. Wow, that's great.
And so
The other
true,
thing,
right? So
yes,
true.
yes, yeah. The other thing that I know is that when we are looking at these disruptions in our life, sometimes we are held back because people around us are questioning why are we doing this? And they're not supportive. And one of the things in your book was the importance of connecting with communities and other people who are non-judgmental because we need that as we grow. And one of the things you said is the single most important criteria to gauge if someone can serve as a supporter of growth is their ability to ask, why not? And I love that because I think that as you and me are like we're coaches where we help people is like, well, why can't you do this? Why can't you listen to your voice? Why not? Right? Versus why? Or why are you doing this? Right. So I think that's a really important distinction, which I really resonated with me.
Thank you for picking up on that because I think it
Yeah.
is one of the most important things of the work and the research was this distinction of who do we need around us or whom do we need around us? I think my grammarian neighbor would get on me on that. Who are these people?
Yes.
And it's so important to recognize that those who are around us, spouses, best friends, family members, even coworkers, very often it's been observed through scientific research that they have a need for us to stay the same. It's part of their stability, right? So when we say, woohoo, we are going to go through this process of growth, right? Because by the way, when we go through transition or we choose transition, it is growth, right? It is actually adult developmental growth. So when we
Mm-hmm.
say we're going to grow, we can upset their stability, right? So
Mm-hmm.
understand that it isn't really out of malice that people respond by saying, why would you do that? It's really at some level about their own stability and their need
Yes.
for that stability, right? And so a lot of people come into a transitioning period and say, oh my goodness, do I have to leave my friends, leave my family, leave my spouse? And the answer is not entirely, right? It may be, and that may be part of your process. But what is absolutely required is you need people around you who can create a safe environment for you to explore. And that's what I reference in the book is trying to find these people who can ask why not. These are
Mm-hmm.
people who cannot see your invisible walls, right? They
Mm-hmm.
don't know they're there, right? Your family member knows they're there, but these people who are new to you are essential because they cannot see those walls. And
Mm-hmm.
not that they're going to tell you to be reckless and break through them, but they're going to help you recognize one, that they're there, and two, how to handle them.
Mm-hmm.
And this is where the beauty of deeply experienced coaches like yourself, Kavita, come into play, and others, right? I have had the great good fortune of facilitating all sorts of groups over the last decade. And it is fascinating how strangers can come together and be that
Yes.
person to say, why not? Right.
Yes.
So
Yes.
these these trusted others are essential, right? We
Mm-hmm.
need them. Sometimes they can be family members, but for real reasons, oftentimes they can't. And we need them because as we move along a trajectory of growth, we need validation sources, right? We say,
Mm-hmm.
if I say to Kavita, I'm thinking of ending a relationship, which by the way, as I look at the trajectory of my current transition, I'm reevaluating relationships that are closest to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And and so I need the safety of an environment to be able to hear myself talk about that and have somebody help me validate and affirm my thinking as I'm
Yes.
exploring. And that isn't to give me an answer, it's to continue to ask me questions so that I can listen to myself in a new way. And that's
Yes.
really what these activities about reconstituting our community are about. It's about finding people who can help ask why not and doing so in an environment where we can get a new source of affirmation and help us
Mm-hmm.
continue to ask questions that can be meaningful to our
Mm-hmm.
growth.
Mm-hmm. Goodness, I can talk to you forever. I learn so much every time you speak.
Well, that's why we love the work we do, Kavita, right?
Yes.
And the great news is that you're an enormous resource to the
Oh,
people
thank
that
you.
have access to you. You have deep experience in the topic of transformational growth, and you're also somebody who is so skilled in the corporate environment. So you are an
Well, thank
invaluable
you.
partner to people who can work with you.
That's very kind of you. Thank you so much. So I know we're almost to the end of our conversation, but I wanted to share one of the last quotes that you had in a book. And this is something that I really try to stress to the women that I coach. And it's this one, and I'll quote, I wish for you an unfettered connection to who you are and a willingness to trust your truth in all the circumstances in your life. The world urgently needs your voice, regardless of its expression or stage of completion. I love that. That just
Yay.
really gave me the chills when I read it because it's so true. I mean, what we have inside of us, the world needs. And it's
Oh,
just a matter of listening to that voice and putting it out there as messy as it is or as
right.
perfect as it is. Or I
Exactly.
sorry, I shouldn't, I was going to ask you your interpretation of it, but I just got involved in
No,
that.
that's
So
exactly it,
yeah,
right? We
yeah.
started by talking about we're at this inflection point in the universe, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have this incredible period of transformation, right? Our workplaces are changing. We have a climate crisis. We have a global refugee and immigration crisis, right? We have longevity changing how we think about our lives. Like it's on every plane, there is radical change. And
Mm-hmm.
never have we needed everyone's voice more than right now.
Mm-hmm.
Right? We will not find the way forward if we have people disengaging or believing their voice doesn't matter.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone's voice matters, regardless of the expression or the community somebody wants to be connected to, right? The answer doesn't matter. That you are connected matters critically.
Mm-hmm.
So the work, if somebody said, what's your work about? It's simply this. It's about engaging people to use their voices, to explore their truth, and to bring it forward in a way that feels comfortable for them. Because it is essential right now. We need everyone. We will not go forward successfully as a humanity without everyone's voice.
Mm. Drop the mic there. I can't, I don't have any other questions for you. That was just, yeah, I mean, that's a great way to end this conversation because it's so important, especially now. And the work that you've done, the research you've done is so vitally important for people to be able to navigate the many changes in their life. And we all go through them and these are valuable tools, lessons that we can all take into consideration in our own lives. So thank you so much.
Kavita, it's been an
I
absolute honor. Thank you.
appreciate it. And next time, maybe you have a third book, then you can come back.
Let's work on this one, but
Yes.
I
Okay.
wish you all the success and again, congratulations on the wonderful work you do in walking next to people who are in transition. It's vital, and I look forward to hearing about how your work continues to grow.
Thank you so much, Linda. I appreciate it. I trust you enjoyed this powerful episode with Linda Rossetti and you consider the disruptions that you may be facing in your life right now as an invitation for transformational growth. Here are her key takeaways. Number one, those moments of disruptions or shifts of how we think about ourselves are an enormous invitation to help us expand. Number two, disruptions repeatedly in our adult lives are normal and common, and we now have this great opportunity to respond differently to them. Number three, changes are very goal oriented, and we are used to make alterations on an intact or static self concept. We are maintaining the stability of our known self concept. Whereas in transitions, the stability, we are welcoming instability for a time, but through it, we are re examining our assumptions upon which our self concept resides. Number four, if we choose transitions, we invert the mountain. We expand as we go up, and if it is repeated, regardless of the circumstances, we only have to make the choice of choosing the next trailhead. Number five, emotions can serve as an oracle, not an obstacle to our success. Number six, hail is a tool to help reframe our emotions so our emotions don't have such power over us on a daily basis. It diffuses an emotion's power over us. Number seven, storytelling is a way to begin to think about what our truth is and to connect in a current way with our voice or our truth. Number eight, You need people around you who can create a safe environment and ask, why not? They are essential for your growth. And number 9, never have we ever needed everyone's voice as we do now. Everyone's voice matters. Engaging people to use their voices is essential right now. Thank you so much for listening. And remember, your emotions can serve as an oracle, not an obstacle to your success. Till next time, stay well and stay safe.